Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy Till, Programme Director at NLA. I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar, which is part of our 100% digital programme that enables you to access our content from the comfort of your own home. At the start of June, we launched NLA's latest insight study, which examines our knowledge networks. The report explores the growth in knowledge-intensive industries across London, Oxford, and Cambridge, known as the Golden Triangle, and examines how the knowledge economy can be strengthened across this region. As part of the report, we presented over 90 exemplar projects that are having a transformational impact on education, healthcare, technology, and innovation sectors in the UK. And in today's webinar, we're looking at 4 of those projects in more detail. And I'm pleased to introduce some of our speakers. First up, we'll go to Michael Foster-Lopes, Associate at Penwa and Facade. Michael, over to you.
Thanks, Amy. You pronounced it much better in the warm-up. But anyway, great to be here. Thanks very much. And I'm really excited to talk to you all about this project. It's definitely been a unique one. I'm not sure we'll ever get to design another building with a decommissioned aeroplane hanging off the side of it. So there's a lot to get through in 8 minutes or 9 minutes. So I'll try to whiz through as quickly as I possibly can. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So the brief we were presented with by Professor Nick Tyler, who's the mastermind behind the project at UCL, was that he needed a building to house the world. So quite a thrilling challenge for us as architects, as you can imagine. Professor Nick and his team, if we go to the next slide, are currently based at Pamela in North London, where they research pretty much any way you can imagine that people might interact with the built environment. From prototyping new tube carriage designs for TfL, how a large crowd of people might escape from an emergency situation or terror threat, right down to the scale of the neurons in our brains, how somebody suffering from dementia might navigate a complex series of corridors, or different lighting and smells might impact on the day-to-day life of somebody with autism, say. What lies behind all of this is really the pursuit of understanding how people perceive and interact with their environments, in order that we ultimately as designers might be able to create healthier and better places to live. So Pearl is a supersized version of the previous facility. It's multi-scalar, it's hyper-flexible, it's transdisciplinary, it's permeable, and it's community-focused. And as UCL's Dean of Engineering puts it, it's a once in a generation opportunity for UCL to lead on a global stage. So to give a bit of wider context, Pearl is part of an innovative approach to national infrastructure research known as UCRIC, which is really the driver for around £600 billion worth of investment in our national infrastructure over the next 50 years. UCRIC is a collaborative network of labs across 15 universities, although Pearl is the only one really that actually puts people at the centre of its approach. The whole idea at Pearl is to look at research in a completely different way. Pearl's new home will be in East London's Dagenham, famous of course for this, Ford's huge factory, which supported miles upon miles of really pretty low quality housing, which is still there largely and is still one of the most deprived areas in the country. So we really couldn't be further from the Oxford and Cambridge corners of the Golden Triangle here. And in 1934, the May and Baker pharmaceutical site was established up the road from the Ford factory. During the post-war recovery period, May and Baker played a really important role in meeting the enormous demand for medicines around the world. And so maybe we can draw some sort of a parallel here with the work, say, AstraZeneca are doing now with Oxford on the COVID vaccine. Fast forward to 2020 and May and Baker are long gone, and what's left is a vast industrial wasteland. The London Borough of Barking and Dagenham are obviously desperate to turn this site into a force for good, so they were thrilled when the opportunity arose for UCL to purchase this piece of land here. And this is the council's vision for the future. And with UCL here in the form of Pearl, this coming together of science, technology, research, and the creative industries will be huge for the borough. So here's Pearl's piece of land there. The buildings on it that you can see there were the most recent additions to the pharmaceutical plant, but for the past few years have actually only been used for filming Avengers movies, believe it or not. And the next slide shows just an early sketch that we did right at the beginning, really, to think about how Pearl might come together on this site. And basically, it's a big box of tricks. The Groove, aptly named by Professor Nick, who's a jazz musician when he's not rethinking the whole world, is a two-story building within a building, and it's the brain box of the laboratory, as well as the public entrance and the interface with the community. And to let everyone know that UCL's landed in Dagenham, we've dressed the front of the building, and plant is plugged in at the far end of the building to really simplify the services strategy. And the rest of the space is the lab itself, with a zone of large flexible storage to one side. So the next slide shows a floor plan, and here you can see how those elements are distributed across the space, with the main entrance in the top left corner and the 100-meter long lab shown in red. And the square grids you can see in the lab are reconfigurable hydraulic flooring units that can be infinitely rearranged, not just shown in these three grids there, and controlled via an iPad. And on the next slide, we come inside the lab space, and you can see some of those flooring units being used to create various experiments and mobile seating for up to 600 members of the public. And there's a huge smart lighting and speaker array above that can help recreate almost any internal or external condition you can imagine. In many ways, this is a lot like a giant black box theatre, except here you're trying to convince the active participants of the experiments, rather than the watching audience as you would in a theatre, that what they are touching or standing on is real. So yeah, and there at the back right of the space, you can see the Groove, which if we go to the next slide, you can see is clad in black timber to ensure it doesn't disturb the experiments too much. And underneath that black timber cladding is a factory-made cross-laminated timber box that's completely structurally independent from the main steel frame, so it could be rapidly assembled on site in just a few days. So here, these overviews inside the Groove, the two-story building, shows super flexible workspace for the researchers that will be reconfigured on a kind of weekly basis, really, to meet the needs of the research projects. And they're overlooking the lab space below. And you can also see on the ground floor workshops for constructing sets and prototypes for experiments, and seminar rooms and community space and entrance on the left. And this is a couple of views of that community arrival space, where locals will be encouraged actively to drop in and have a chat with the team at Pearl, maybe about that dodgy crossing on the high street that just doesn't work for their wheelchair. And this gives an overview of the structure. So the timber box you can see in the corner there, and the main steel frame with its large trusses that completely span the 40-meter wide lab. And this builds in ultimate flexibility for the future. And on the roof, by taking up every single square inch of space with PV panels, as well as optimizing the building envelope and structure, we've managed to achieve UCL's first ever net zero carbon building, demonstrating the university's real commitment to addressing the climate emergency and leadership in the higher education sector. And in the bottom left of the image, you can see a wavy roof next door, which is actually listed as it's one of the first ever examples of this kind of concrete shell structure. And here in the background, you can see the wavy roof is the backdrop to the May and Baker's old staff bowling green, which has since been built on and is now exactly where Pearl is currently being constructed. So when designing Pearl's main entrance and architectural facade, we wanted to reference the wavy roof as a nod to the site's heritage. So hence the gentle scalloping of these 9-meter high industrial weathered steel panels that peel away from the glazed main entrance area to provide solar shading and signal arrival. And we perforated these panels to get light into the entrance space and to bring a sense of movement to the facade. And through lots of testing with Professor Nick and his team, we moved away from any regular patterns like some of the ones at the top there, which could be a cause of distressing visual noise for people with sensory or neurological difficulties. So we instead looked at natural imagery, bird murmurations and people flow and crowd movement, which the last two there are big parts of the work that goes on at Pearl. And so zooming in, these perforations are made up of sort of anthropomorphic blobs to represent people, which are then carried through onto the signage across the site and the building. And the overall effect layers materiality and graphics and building identity that begin to tell Pearl's story. And the building is a giant, finely tuned piece of research equipment, both inside and out, and is there really to serve and collaborate with its community from the local right up to the international. And yes, at some point, 2 Chinook helicopters are going to lower that plane into place. And touch wood, so far with no disruption on site during lockdown, we're on track to complete in spring 21. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Michael. A really interesting project. And just before we move on to the next presentation, just a reminder for everyone watching that there is a Q&A function just at the bottom of your screen. So if you've got any questions for the panel, we'll be doing a Q&A at the end. So if you're happy to, say your name and where you're from, and I'll put those questions to the panel at the end. Next up, we have Darius Omega, who's the Director of Science and Higher Education at NBBJ, and he's going to be presenting the Life and Mind building for Oxford University.
Thank you very much, Amy, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk to you about a project for Oxford, which was born out of necessity some 3 years ago, and it's a building that many know and have been working in and have really loved, actually, for the last 50 years, originally designed by Sir Leslie Martin in 1965 and built and completed in 1970. But 3 years ago, the estates team there realised that they needed to abandon the building with a number of health and safety issues to do with the structure and also embedded asbestos. So this building is now currently being demolished, but a plan is being developed and has been for some time in how to replace the departments who were occupying it. Next slide. And just in terms of location, for those of you who know Oxford, sorry if we just go back one, the building itself sits at the northeast side of the city and is a bookend really to the science quarter, which is also now falling into a conservation area. And the scale of this building as it stands currently, the Leslie Martin building, is one of the bigger university buildings within the Oxford campus. So what is the building about? It's about bringing together 3 departments, experimental psychology, zoology and plant sciences, and bringing those 3 together into a new, really quite transformational experience for research, teaching and learning. And of the 3, the 2 departments have closest synergies really are zoology and plant sciences. And in the new facility, once it's ready, they will merge into one department to be known as biology. But in addition to that, the building is also about giving back to the public and engaging in a wider way, and we'll see how that happens a bit further down the line. We've had to do a lot of engagement with the university. Obviously, bringing 3 big departments together involves a huge number of stakeholders, and our team have been managing that with the university over the last year and a half, and it's involved a significant input just to help develop the brief, refine the approach, and really understand some of the requirements of those departments, and importantly, how they will interact in the new facility itself. And then the wider issues around how the estate itself wants to run the facility, how that engages with the community, and the number of the logistical issues in really bringing a new building of this scale on stream. Next slide, please. what we've tried to do in going through that really intense process with users and stakeholders is really understand some of the issues that they are working on in terms of their research and development, and then trying to pull and draw upon some of those into some themes for our building, and really make that work and reflect back how the facility can really be part and parcel of a daily working environment. Next. One of the other challenges that was brought to us as well is an approach to sustainability. And in this case, looking towards, at the very earliest stage of the design, how we would take this through to Oxford City Council for approval. The university themselves have developed a very demanding and challenging sustainability design guide. And that's really hinged around developing this facility using design principles from Passive House. And in addition to that, we've agreed an approach with the university to also look at a 40% carbon reduction over the Part L compliant baseline. But more than that, we were interested in trying to see how that sustainability approach really tapped into other features, especially the human and social aspects of sustainability, and how that can be driven into the building itself. Next. A very quick look at the site itself. As I said, the current building occupies a corner site, which has a blind corner to it. And I think what we found was that there were a number of challenges around circulation, access, logistics, neighbours, views, and so forth. And we tried to digest that and then reinterpret it into a new facility. And one of the important things that we've had to deal with is the retention of a very new building that was bolted onto the back of the old Tinbergen building that you can see at the bottom end of the site. It's called the Chemistry Teaching Laboratory, which is only a 2-year-old new facility. And that has had to be retained and will be adapted, modified, and kept in full operation throughout this new development. So what are we doing in terms of a design response? We're connecting people. It's about bringing a new facility together. It involves postgraduate research, scientists, academics, as well as students. It's also about engaging the wider community. And one of the ideas was to give back some of the space on this site, whilst addressing some of the issues around public realm and accessibility. It also needs to be a very adaptable building. Much of the research that goes on is grant funded, and those groups ebb and flow with the grants. So we've needed to really focus hard on how wet labs could become offices, and how we contain the right level of write-up space to service some of those laboratories. And furthermore, how in the long term, because this is a building for 50 years, how the science may change and adapt, and that's how that's tackled and accommodated within the structure itself. And then contextually, this is a big new building in Oxford, and as you can imagine, especially within the conservation area, there are a huge number of contextual issues, certainly around massing, scale, skyline, impact on Oxford itself, long distance views. And then importantly, from a well-being perspective, how the building is connected to nature, given that it's on the edge of some playing fields and parkland, and how that is brought into the building to really help the well-being of its occupants in the long term. Just very quickly, site-wide logistics. Keeping this building running is very important, and not only complex, but how we manage that through the process of keeping adjacent neighbours who are very close to this very large building site up and running and functional throughout the course of the next 3 to 4 years. Quickly, in terms of scale, this is a 25,000 square metre building, bigger than the existing Tinbergen building, but on a smaller footprint because of the way we've given some of that space back to the public realm. Principal contents are traditional teaching and lecture facilities. There are also a number of laboratories, both category 2 wet labs and dry labs for the experimental psychology department. And on the top of the what we're calling the flex block, where the laboratories are embedded, there are also a number of glass houses and growth chambers. So a very complex mix, and how do we bring that into a new building? We've taken the idea of having 2 principal blocks, the flex block containing laboratories, and the office block, which contains most of the write-up space. And these are brought together through a common atrium space. One of the things that we've had to consider also is the long-term adaptability of the building, but also the buildability, trying to ensure that we can get this development up and running as soon as possible, given that two of the departments are currently in temporary accommodation. So looking at structural grids, planning grids, service risers and cores, and also vibrational analysis so that we can anticipate or best adapt the building in the long term to future needs of the science. Coming back to that idea of a shared ecosystem and drawing upon the themes of the building in terms of its research, we've tried to embed some of those ideas in some of the common spaces within the facility, primarily from entrance point through up the building in the atrium and in the general meeting areas along the way, to give an experience, a shared experience, an opportunity to both meet, relax, work and engage, and really bring those three departments together in a facility that they haven't really experienced before. So this is how it's shaping up. This is just giving a long section with elevation view into the building, and really also trying to explain how the majority of the teaching space, which is postgraduate students coming into the building, are occupying the lower levels of the facility. So we've developed an approach to bringing students in at lower ground from a common entrance externally, as well as then connecting them through to the rest of the building with atrium space, daylight flooding down the building, and also really trying to ensure that there is a rich feel to the lower areas of the building in terms of light and activity. Kind of just a working section at the moment across the building. This is a densely populated building as well, a maximum capacity of 2,000 people in here. So how do you deal with that in terms of daylight, well-being and so on? And one of the key themes here is that we ensure that building is never one floor away from green space, whether you're at ground, lower ground or at the top floor. And these next images will just give you a feel for the quality of environment that we're trying to build into the facility as you experience the building from either a student or an academic's perspective. Here, upper levels where in the office block, it's important to be able to break out from conventional office space. We're developing spaces similar to this, which we've called a town centre, where people can congregate, gather, meet informally and work at the same time. And as we progress up the building, next slide, there are opportunities that we've incorporated to build in terraces along the way. Sorry, just one back. And what we've tried to experience with the best use of the facility is making the use of the fantastic views as you gain almost a unique perspective from the upper levels of the building, looking back to the city centre of Oxford and its beautiful skyline. Here there's an opportunity for cafe and functional space, and a really great place to really celebrate the occupants' activities, whether it's for students, researchers, or indeed third parties. Next slide. Very quickly, coming back to the outside and how one approaches the building, I mentioned this external space. We're calling it a public plaza, and it's a clever device both to activate this corner of the site, to engage the public in good weather, but also draw people into the building and make the best use, and creating a really live and activated public area immediately outside the building itself. This also links the ground to lower ground entrance. And one of the issues we've been challenged with is a VAT strategy around the building's funding. Given that teaching attracts VAT and research does not, we've grouped teaching, as I said, to the lower levels of the building. And that has really helped bring us a sort of rigorous approach to where we put lecture spaces, seminar spaces and so forth, and really make best use of the budget we've got without incurring VAT penalties. Next slide. Very quickly, Facade Drivers, an external building envelope. Given its orientation and functionality, we've been doing lots of studies, including some computational analysis around how the facade is working. We've deployed a blue roof and also a huge amount of photovoltaics across the top of the office block. And next slide. And we're also looking at materiality as well. Much as the last speaker, we're talking to the Oxford City planners a lot about the contextuality and materiality of the building. How is that reflected in terms of a balanced budget and what we do with off-site fabrication? In this case, we're currently looking at reconstituted stone panels and a layering system to also develop a very super insulated building envelope that achieves the passive house principles and guidelines that we've been tasked with tackling. Next slide. And similarly, one of the issues that we're trying to embed into the detailing of the facade is perhaps reflecting some of the studies that go on within the research. So we've looked also at some of the patterns and signals that come out of the science from the studies of animals, birds, plants, and humans, and whether that can be subtly reflected into the building facade itself. Next. And just a couple of images to end on. This just gives you an overview of how the building is panning out. The design is well underway, and in a short while we'll be looking to make a full planning application. There's a lot more I could tell you about. We're very excited about this project. It will be the biggest academic building the university has commissioned in its history. It has a prominent site and we have the privilege of really making something special this site for the next 50 years. So we're delighted to be involved and look forward to updating you perhaps in a year's time or so as it progresses. Thank you.
Darius, thank you very much. Next up, we've got Gavin Henderson, who's the Principal Director at Stanton Williams, to tell us about the Zayed Centre for Research into Rare Diseases in Children.
Thank you, Amy, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk about the Zayed Centre for Research, which has been a very unique project, very much one of a kind. It's the world's first paediatric centre for research and treatment of rare diseases. I want to start with this image. It's an artwork by Mark Titchener, based on a quote from Helen Keller, the disabled activist. And it's what you see when you first enter the building. In fact, it's very visible from the street. To give you a sense of impact, it's 8.5 meters across. And because of that, it's become something of a manifesto for the project as a whole. It's a project that's very much about bringing people together, clinicians, patients, research staff, and the urban context. And it's about bringing together Great Ormond Street, UCL, and others working across the network of the Knowledge Quarter, all in order to achieve more through collaboration, proximity, and interaction. It's also about supporting the idea of the virtuous circle between research and treatment. And that's very much, next slide, please. What these artworks, which are sketches from the children in the, sorry, could you go back one? These are sketches from the children in the hospital, which are drawings of the building. And the one in the right in particular captures the idea of this idea of bench to bedside research, treatment feeding into research, feeding back into treatment. So it's a unique and remarkable brief, but it's also a remarkable site. It's directly opposite London's Coram's Fields, a space dedicated to the well-being of children for over 250 years. So there's almost a symbiotic relationship with the site. It was originally the site of London's Foundling Hospital, a place obviously named for care, but interestingly also somewhere Handel performed. Hogarth set up an art gallery here. So there's an incredible legacy on this site. Our actual site location is the wall on the bottom right of this image. And what we saw in this was an opportunity really to re-engage care and science with the public realm and the urban context, to celebrate the often invisible work of clinicians and scientists and re-engage that with urban culture. So, next slide. This is Coram's Field, sorry. This is Coram's Field today. Our building is picked out in yellow. And it's got a very prominent, almost civic facade with views northwards over Corham's Fields. And then to the south, it steps down towards the more domestic scale of the Bloomsbury Conservation Area. Quite a challenging environment to create a major new building. It's a project that's best understood really in sections. So here, the larger volume is facing Corham's Fields to the left-hand side. And there's almost a layer cake of different activities, each of which has its own technical and legislative requirements. There's a lot of complexity into integrating these into one building. There's a double height laboratory at lower ground level, which engages with the street. Ground floor and first floor are largely outpatients facilities. Then above that, we have the research workspace, and at the top of the building, a GMP facility, which is Europe's largest clean room facility of its type, developing treatments at the genetic scale. So the experience of the building is very much around the interaction of these different activities, and also about the interaction with the external environment. That's views out and daylight in, which is fundamental for the well-being of staff and patients, but in particular the connection to public realm and that idea of being aware in the street of the activity and purpose of the building. So a central concept really is the visibility of activities from the street, and which you see in this early section, looking down from the street into the double height laboratory and across to the outpatients department. So this is the facade that faces Corham's Fields. It's got a series of terracotta fins that give it this almost civic quality. But what they do is they screen certain activities, and then they allow engagement between other activities and the spaces outside, not only into the laboratory and outpatients entrance areas at ground floor, but also the large first floor waiting space for outpatients at first floor level. So you look in from the street directly into the laboratory, sometimes right the way through the building. And there's a remarkable sense of transparency. I think because it's north facing without the solar coatings you often get on the glass, you get these kind of views across the laboratory to the outpatients areas beyond. And the facade itself, although it looks oblique, it looks quite solid, which it makes it sit within the conservation area context of brick buildings. It's actually very glazed, almost like a loggia, and the building's experienced as a series of sort of spatial layers moving backwards from the street. So you enter through that facade, there's a single entrance for everyone, and then you move either right towards the outpatients areas or left towards the research parts of the building. So I'm going to briefly talk you through that experience. So this is actually standing on the bridge, which is glazed to the laboratory space. You get a real sense here of how, when you're within the building, the activity of the urban landscape is part of your experience of the interior. And looking the other way, you see Mark Titchener's artwork with the street to the left. And then down in that lower ground floor, you're still very aware of the relationship always with the public realm outside, up above you on the left here with the views to Corham's Fields and the children who are looking down on the activity of the scientists who are now occupying this space. And it's a building that's throughout is characterized by a very warm, tactile use of materials, a non-clinical sense of space, which was an important part of our brief. And that extends into the outpatients department itself. So this is that outpatients waiting area at first floor level, where children and their families overlook Corham's Fields. The brief was to create a calm and dignified environment which didn't condescend to children. But it's an environment that is also activated by children, events, artworks commissioned through the Gosh Art strategy, and interactive installations. This is an installation, Kinds of Life, by Random International. It interprets ideas about play curiosity and the link to science, and it moves around the space in reaction to the activities and movements of people occupying the building. And here you see it within the main atrium space of the building, which is a space that makes connections between the activities that are going on within the building visually and also culturally. It's become a space for activities. This is a performance going on within that space. And also in terms of how you move from those spaces at ground floor level that are very much part of the street experience up through increasingly private floors where people interact and meet each other on these very prominent staircases, the workspace environment, and then up. These are the workspaces, very simple, robust spaces, and then up to the more isolated world of the clean room environment at the top of the building. So I'm going to end on this view, which shows that layered arrangement of different spaces, and the clean rooms are the setback volume at the top of the building, in contrast to the illuminated space that draws you in at ground floor level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gavin. Next up, we've got Matthew Gulcher, Director at Levitt Bernstein, to tell us about the UCL Faculty of Laws. Thanks, Matthew.
Hi. First slide, please. Hello, everyone. I'm going to just talk to you about UCL Laws, which is known to them as Bentham House. First slide, please. This is it. It was, as we found it, was the combination of two buildings. This corner one, Bentham House, which we cleverly managed to get listed in the middle of the planning process, and the building to the right, which was known as Hillel House, which UCL purchased about nearly 20 years ago now, and added in to the law faculty and linked it to it. And it's in fact a Seafoot building, probably not one of his best, and I'll come back to that. I think the project really was about trying to make a single entity out of these two buildings, improving and extending the teaching facilities. There were issues about sort of legibility, circulation, how you moved through the building and experienced it, particularly in the link between the new and the struggle to find some sort of fluidity around that. It was about improving the variety of teaching space as well. UCL Laws taught in a very sort of traditional way. But I think for us, it was one of the projects that we're really interested in that deals with how you get a better and more informal interaction between students and tutors, and how that can be done incidentally without having a sort of formal set piece arrangement for it, and in that way improving the teaching experience. Next slide, please. So this is where it sits. It's sort of a little bit out of an outpost. The main UCL campus is the blue building in the bottom of the page, and the laws faculty is sitting east of that. So it had to be sort of a little bit self-contained from that perspective in terms of its facilities, and having enough teaching space in there to do most of the curriculum. It sits on the corner of Ensley Street and Ensley Gardens, and the main road to the left is the Euston Road as well. Next slide, please. This is how we found it. This was the arrangement of the faculty between the two buildings. So on this stacked drawing on the left-hand side of the screen is Bentham House. Bentham House was in fact designed pre-war but built in the 50s as a trade union building. UCL bought it in the 60s, and then, as I say, they bought Hillel House, which they renamed the Gideon Schreiber wing on the right-hand side, and you can see just the one link at first floor going across there, and you can see the state of the teaching facilities as we found it that very much needed updating, and the issues relating to poor wayfinding and circulation. Next slide, please. Bentham House, the listed building, has one or two really delightful spaces. This sort of feel of sort of polished timber, sort of as a trade union headquarters, I thought was interesting, but actually very easy for a formal laws department to take on. And this was what they called the moot court. I think it was originally a trade union sort of meeting space, a conference space, but the UCL used this as a mock courtroom. Very interesting. Next slide, please. And this is the first floor plan. On the left side, the existing arrangement, you can see the single link through a very narrow corridor between the two buildings. So they operated more or less independently. And on the right, the moves we made, which I'll talk you through, to open up and improve that arrangement with a new extension on the back of the Hillel House building to the top of this drawing. Next slide, please. So this is our principle, really. It was about bringing people in at the corner, if you remember the picture on the first slide, but getting people into what we call the faculty hub, into the middle of the plan, in the middle of the place where everything circulates from, and then from there circulating out. And sort of as you go up the building, it becomes increasingly private or faculty orientated, and the lower floors are more public and teaching orientated. And that's a theme that we use on quite a lot of our education buildings that need public access. Next slide, please. And so on section, it arranges like this. Bentham House, the original listed building on the right-hand side. Teaching spaces in orange here with some subterranean teaching rooms as well, some of which are actually out of circulation. This is yet another building in Camden that the River Fleet sits on top of, and they have problems, have had historic problems here. The bottom two levels on the left-hand side were existing, and we extended up and out across there to provide more teaching facilities. And in the green on the middle of the plan is our intervention to link the two buildings through an atrium space, exposing what was the rear envelope of the original building as well. Next slide. And the circulation, as I said, improved. So as you come into the building, the foyer space was completely opened up. We reorientated access, turning left, and then with a view up the new opening, which you see on the left, into the new atrium space. And so there's a bit of sort of compression and release going on here as you come from a sort of darker space and a more confined space into a wonderful open, light and airy atrium space. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I've got a bit of an animation going on here. I hope it works. I thought it was worth putting in because it really explains how the organization of the building works. And really, we were working to try and, as I say, get people into the middle of the building as soon as we possibly can. So on the rear of the building here, we stacked the new teaching spaces, research and study space. You'll see these being added on, and a social hub at what was the first floor level, with some seminar space on the next level up, but very much attached, and then the academic offices above. And actually these are the green roof technology to achieve BREEAM, and then the new hub space in the middle and a new facade on Ensley Street. So this is taking you through the entry sequence. There's an awful lot of flexible space, undedicated space, and the success of these of the building is very much about how much informal working goes on. I'll go into that a little bit more detail. This is one of the principal new teaching spaces, which is actually used as for a variety of different uses. All the seats move away. They can use it for conferencing and so forth. This is touchdown space, which works, as I said, in a sort of very fluid way off the atrium, the stair at the back, and then a variety of the converted space within Bentham House and on the rear of the building, a similar architectural language that draws the materiality of the two buildings together. Next slide, please. So just in a little bit more detail, these two views from right to left give you the sense of arriving in that hub space, and then how we've broken through on the rear of the original Bentham House, which is listed, to provide very flexible, fluid space. I think when we started this process, like most academics, people were very reluctant to come out from their offices for individual tutoring. And I think that one of the successes has been very different ways people interact within this in an informal way. Next slide, please. This is a lower view of the same space. So we've knocked through and created these different tones of rooms. Beyond is what used to be a common room. It's slightly more sort of lush and sit down, but the people working on laptops there, they can take food in there as well, into the atrium spaces, and you can see sort of the tutoring that's going on. The architecture here is just being cleaned up and exposed, and you can see the new structure adjacent that has had to pierce that pierces the space and provides these bridge links to the other levels. Next slide, please. This is the principal cafe hub space, which has this picture window you shall see on the elevations towards the end, but makes this relationship with the street, which is very important. It was a sort of slightly impenetrable faculty. Both buildings were that slightly set back. The windows weren't animated, and for the first time you can see activity in and out, and it of course floods this space, which is quite restricted ceiling heights, with good quality of light. Next slide, please. The teaching space is, as I said, terribly flexible with all you'd expect in a modern seminar space. These seats remove and fold away into stores at the back of it, and they use it for a variety of means. Next slide, please. Normal seminar spaces. The ventilation strategy here, as I said, I think we achieve BREEAM excellence is sort of mixed mode. So the atrium is used for passive ventilation. Most of the office have opening windows, and mechanical ventilation is cooling only where we need it within the highly populated lecture and seminar spaces. Next slide, please. And then a variety of other spaces on the left, really interesting little huddle rooms that are on bridge links in the atrium, where for 2 or 3 people. Some of the refurbished space, which have a completely different feel within the middle informal meeting rooms. You can see the efforts we've gone through to give a variety of furnishing, soft furnishings, and then a window seat where people pitch up with laptops and sit in as well. Next slide, thanks. And then just to finish up with about the elevation treatment. So this is the arrangement as we found it. You've got these Georgian terraces on the left and Bentham House important stone. Sorry, other way around. The terraces on the right listed grade 2, Bentham House recently listed grade 2, and the Seafoot building in the middle. Next slide. So we needed to find a way to sort of mediate between the two. The stone on the left and the brick with stone features on the right, and window pattern. So this elevation sort of demonstrates how we did that. We took the window, the fenestration rhythm from the houses, and then used the materiality of Bentham House itself coming the other way. So it formed a single entity to all intents and purposes, and a new identity for laws, and that's the new elevation on the left-hand side slotted in place. And next slide, please. And that's how it looks. So you can see we had a bit of a struggle here. The levels never aligned properly, so we've had to work on getting the proportion of the windows correct, which is we've played about with these spandrel stone infill panels above to get the right feel in relation to the existing listed street form. And there's the picture window, which you saw a picture of previously looking out. Next slide, please. And then finally, on the rear of the building, where the atrium link building meets the Bentham House flank. So we're using the same palette of materials in a sort of spidery way, which sort of make their way and into form the new extensions using the same palette. And on the right-hand side here, you can see the new extension as quite a solid thing, reflecting Bentham House on the opposite side of this little courtyard terrace, which at some point in the future we'll hope they'll use as a make into a usable terraced space. And I think that is the last slide. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Matthew. And that is the last of our 4 presentations, 4 very different and very complex projects, but some interesting common themes emerging around flexibility of space and reconfigure of space, drive towards net zero and sustainability, and obviously occupiers with some very specific needs. So we have a couple of questions coming in from the floor. So the first question we have is, what are the plans for post-occupancy evaluation for these projects? Are there any new approaches to assessing the value and impact of the spaces, particularly around their contribution to the wider knowledge economy? Darius, would you like to take that question first for us?
Sure, thank you. Well, for us, I mean, it's interesting because when we start projects like this, we always look to the last projects that we've recently completed and taking lessons learned from those in particular. So in our case, recent university projects elsewhere, for Southampton, at Manchester and at UEA, where we've developed science projects with a large number of stakeholders. And I think one of the things that we find interesting is how quickly the science is changing in many of these environments. And so, and then the relationship between laboratory use and office space and the amount of work, literally write-up space that is needed. I think the other interesting thing we're finding, especially now in this post-COVID environment, is a complete reappraisal of how our past lessons may need to be revisited. Workplace environments may be changing significantly. So we're trying to really work in a very dynamic environment, anticipating needs for future students, future researchers, future scientists, whilst keeping a project moving. And so in this case for Oxford, the post-occupancy evaluation has already started in some ways by virtue of our last projects and our current engagement with stakeholders. And it will continue through the process. And I dare say the conversations we're having now will be hot topics throughout the next stage of its development. And critically, with our senior user groups and heads of department, there's already thoughts about the evolving brief, how the building will last, and where we need to really invest time, energy, and thought into the design process to ensure longevity of the building.
Thank you, Darius. Gavin, you also talked about the importance of collaboration on your project, particularly around brief development. Is that the same for post-occupancy evaluation?
Yes, I mean, I would just certainly agree with Darius that we try and look back at all of our previous projects and draw lessons from those, and the post-occupancy evaluation is a key part of that. So we were building on lessons that we learned from the Sainsbury laboratory in Cambridge, which sounds like a long time ago, but was actually completed shortly before we started work on Great Ormond Street Hospital. And we've been going through a soft landing process, and both Great Ormond Street and UCL are absolutely committed to the post-occupancy review process. It's actually a very sustainable building. So one aspect of that, it achieved BREEAM Excellent, and it's a 37% improvement on Part L. So we want to understand how that is performing, but I think it's very often for us, the things we want to understand most closely are those kind of human issues or social issues. As you say, it's the interaction, it's how people use use the spaces. So the kind of questionnaires that draw out people's responses to the moves we've been making, their response to the kind of visibility in the laboratory space, that was a very interesting discussion as we took the design forward, and something that we've had positive feedback so far. But obviously we want to really understand how people feel about being in these spaces. It's those kind of human issues that I think we you know, almost the technical issues we can deal with, we can work our way through, but it's actually understanding that human dynamic within the building that I think is a very subtle issue in design and to draw out post-occupancy.
Great, thank you, Gavin. And Matthew, do you have anything to add on how you can measure the value of the new spaces you've created? Oh, Matthew, I think you're on mute. Let's just get you on.
Yeah, sorry. You're just being creative with the question for a minute and our current circumstances. UCL, you know, have a lot of very crowded accommodation or a need for a lot of accommodation, and have done a lot of work about utilization within the space, about how people work. And it won't be a surprise to anybody who's either presented today or listening that getting academics out of single offices has always been a target for sort of estates departments universally. But I do think one thing that is interesting now, that this whole debate about student experience and what they expect and how they want to be taught, particularly in the circumstances we're experiencing right now, where we're not in the same room together, is going to have a real long-term effect in the way our academic buildings are used. And I don't know whether there will be distance learning, but that would have a huge impact on places like UCL and universities in terms of the amount of space they need and the types of space in which they need to be able to teach and learn. So I think in terms of sort of post-occupancy, certainly at Laws, I think Laws have discovered that there are different ways of doing what they did formerly before. And I think current circumstances will mean we'll be designing buildings very differently, and probably less space per person into the future, knowing that not everybody needs 3 or 4 square meters in order to be taught.
Thank you, Matthew. We have a couple of other questions coming in, so I'll move on to the next one. Do the panelists foresee a fundamental change to how we design spaces for collaboration in light of recent behavioural changes? Are these spaces flexible enough to deal with any future changes? Michael, you touched on reconfigure of space, automation and flexibility. Would you like to take that one?
Yeah, well, Pearl is just such an incredible example of a building that is just set up to deal with it. Actually, I mean, it's kind of an amazing coincidence that it's coming to completion at this time. I mean, forget our design for it. The brief, what it's there for is really to test all of this sort of stuff. So what they'll be doing, the fascinating work that's going to come out of Pearl over the next few months and years, will be, they'll be focusing hugely on how behaviors will be changing. They have the space there in that huge lab to actually test this sort of physical distancing, what the implications are on society and behavior. So they're already actually at Pamela even testing how people will be getting on and off buses safely. But they'll be at Pearl, they'll be able to look at that at much larger scales. They'll set up full-scale theatres so they can see how people can interact in those sorts of spaces. They're also working with Moorfields Eye Hospital, who we are kind of, it's a bit of a coincidence of a link, but we're designing Moorfields' new hospital in King's Cross, and Pearl and Moorfields are now coming together to look at how ophthalmology procedures can be undertaken safely with the appropriate distancing and all the rest of it. Obviously you have to be right up close to do an operation on somebody's eye, so there's all sorts of complexities. But Pearl is just this amazing opportunity for all of us for some of this stuff to be uncovered and got under the skin of, and that will filter through to university life more generally. How do students and staff operate?
Great, thank you, Michael. Darius, anything to add on that question?
I think I would add, you know, as we look ahead, and especially given the experience we're all having currently working from home, that increasingly buildings, really whatever their function, are about places to meet and to collaborate and to socialize. And I think we've all proven, probably for the last few months, that we can somehow get through, not everybody, but many of us can get through the kind of work that we do. And I'm interested to see how university buildings will develop in the future to really act as a catalyst for socialization more than, in fact, the learning, because we can do distance learning, we can be online, we can, you know, learn remotely. But however good the Zoom meeting might be, you can't replace the subtlety, nuance of being in the same room as somebody else and having informal meetings and just, you know, happen chance encounters. And I think for science buildings especially, those breakthrough moments often happen in a way that you cannot plan for. And I think that's where we need to focus our time, our energy and our efforts in still creating buildings of delight that will encourage people to come together for really special creative moments.
Thank you. We are nearly out of time, but Gavin's waving his hand. So quickly, Gavin, what?
Well, I suppose, yes, I was just going to add to that. Yes, I'm less convinced we'll need less space, but it may be different space, because actually the socializing is really the most important thing in the student campus, the interaction in the research environment. And that's not about bums on seats. It's about actually something that probably does require a bit more space and fewer workspace stations to get to work, to create that kind of collaborative environment. And that's probably the change we're needing to look at. And it may be not about one permanent future, but also about really working with buildings that can continue to flex and change in response to crises like these. And actually one thing we've seen at Zyde Centre is it's actually now researching COVID. It's not researching rare disease at this particular moment, or at least that's not its only focus. So we have to be aware of designing buildings, as we already were moving towards, which are adaptable to shifts and changes and challenges as they arise.
Thank you, Gavin. Well, we have got a couple of other questions, but I'm afraid we are at time, and I think we did cover some of those points in the answers to the previous questions. So just before we wrap, I'd like to say a huge thank you to our programme champions, Bidwell's, Creative Places, London Legacy Development Corporation, Mitsui Hudson, Perkins & Will, Pemmo and Facade, and Stanhope, and our supporters, NBBJ. Thank you very much for supporting this programme. It enables the work that we do, the research that we do, and these events. And there are more events to come. I'd encourage everyone to download our latest report if you haven't already. It's on nla.london, where you can see these projects and the 90 other projects that we have as part of that showcase. So thanks again to our panel for your presentations.